So we'll give everybody just another minute or two to log in. And if you guys want to introduce yourselves, let us know where you're joining from. You're welcome to do so in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. So we'll give everybody just another minute or two to log in. And if you guys want to introduce yourselves, let us know where you're joining from. You're welcome to do so in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know why that was doing a weird echo, but if you were curious, I'm still going to welcome you and give everybody another minute. And if anybody is interested, we do have captions that you can turn on Zoom. So I think that's either in the bottom or the top, wherever your menu bar is, you can click show captions. It is closed captioned in English today. Oh, good. Hi, Chris and Martha. Good to see you guys again. We've got some movie Mythbusting alum here. Amazing. Oh, good. I've recognized a couple of names. So welcome back. So I've got 7:01 on my end. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time and go ahead and get started. So welcome. My name is Haley Fenner, and I am the manager of digital learning at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I am happy to be your host tonight for Movie Mythbusting. For anybody who has never joined us before, welcome. This is an ongoing series where we look at films and we talk about what the movie got right, what it got wrong. Did we enjoy it? Did we not? And we try and collect that to our collection or the collection of partnering institutions and the stories they can tell. So we've partnered with a variety of people, and this spooky season, we are really excited to partner with the Poe Museum. So this evening, we are going to be talking about The Pale Blue Eye. And we are joined by Emma Clark, who is the manager of education, or education manager, sorry, at the Poe Museum, who's going to sort of take us through the film and tell us a little bit about Poe's life and time at West Point. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Emma.
Thank you so much, Haley. Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation of movie Mythbusting of The Pale Blue Eye. I hope you all got a chance to watch the movie. It actually came out of December of last year. So I think it's a great start to this spooky season. Of course, working at the Poe Museum, we love the Halloween October season. And what we're going to do tonight is focus a little bit about kind of the history, Poe's upbringing here in Richmond, connected to some collection objects, and then talk about his time at West Point, and then kind of focus on what the film got right or didn't get right, like Haley said. Even looking at the screen here, you can see a picture of Poe on the left-hand side and of British actor Harry Melling, who plays Poe in this film, side by side. And when you really put the two side by side, I do think they look pretty similar. So that's one of the many things that the movie does get right, is Poe's look at this time. But let's go ahead and jump in and talk a little bit about Poe's upbringing here in Richmond. So Edgar Poe is actually born as just Edgar Poe in January 19th, 1809, up in Boston, Massachusetts. He's initially born to David and Eliza Poe. Now, this is a portrait of Poe's mother on the left-hand side, Eliza Poe. So both David and Eliza are traveling actors. They'll travel all along the East Coast. So a lot of people, when they hear that, they think Poe had a pretty playful and whimsical childhood. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the case. David will abandon the family when Poe is just a little baby, and Eliza here at just 24 will pass away when Poe is not even 3 years old. She will perform down here in Richmond before she passes away, and if anyone is a local Richmonder, you've probably heard of the Richmond Theater fire, which you can see on your screen here, and the Richmond Theater is where Eliza will give her last performance just 3 weeks before the fire burns down. So again, now and not even 3 years old, Edgar Poe is now orphaned. Thankfully, he is taken in by a foster family here in Richmond. So here you can see John Allen and Frances Allen. They are a wealthy, childless couple living here in Richmond. And Frances gets to know Liza before she passes away and decides to take in Edgar Poe as their foster child. And this is how Edgar Poe takes on the middle name of Edgar Allan Poe. So things are looking up for Poe. He now has a permanent family to live with, although he'll still very much experience a rocky childhood here in Richmond. Both him and his foster father, John Allen, did not get along too well. The two would fight quite often. John Allen's one of the wealthiest men in Richmond at this time, very business-oriented, and young Edgar, a little bit less so. So because of the quarrels between the two, John Allen will never adopt Edgar into his family. Edgar will only remain their foster child. So we actually see a picture of the Allen home here. This was taken several years after both the Allens and Poe would have passed away, but the Allens were a very wealthy family, and so Poe grew up very wealthy in the Allen home. Unfortunately, it no longer stands today. It would have been around 14th and Franklin, around that area today, 14th and Main. However, we have preserved a lot of the collection objects, or the objects that would have been in that home within our museum collection today. So if you come and visit the Poe Museum, which I encourage you all to do this Halloween season, you could see Poe's childhood bed, furniture from the Allen home, glassware, and whatnot. And we can see some of those objects right here on the screen. So Poe will have a pretty typical education here in Richmond. This is around the same time this painting was done is when Poe's growing up here in Richmond. He's very interested in poetry from a young age. And during this time, when he is 15 years old, Poe will actually create a world record, which still stands in Richmond today. Edgar Allan Poe has the world record for the longest mile swam upstream in our James River. That record is 6 miles. And I always just say a quick disclaimer, we do not endorse anyone to try to beat that record because it's very unsafe to do. So again, this is kind of I feel like a lot of people when they hear this get really surprised because they kind of picture Poe as this kind of scrawny, gothic kid, but he was very physically fit, was interested in poetry from a young age as well. Another interesting fact when Poe's growing up here in Richmond is he'll become a part of the Junior Honor Color Guard and actually stand guard in Richmond when the Marquis de Lafayette makes his farewell tour around the U.S. in 1824. So he'll get to meet the Marquis de Lafayette, and we suppose that this is a pretty monumental moment for Poe. His grandfather served with Lafayette, and so, this may have been what inspired Poe to go serve in the military and eventually go to West Point as well. So that was when Poe was 15 years old. He is now 17 years old. And, like a lot of 17-year-olds still do today, Poe decides to go off and attend college. Poe attends the University of Virginia as a part of its second class in 1826. He is registered as 136 students out of 177. And he will be there from February to December of 1826. So you may think, these are the party college years for Poe. That is not necessarily the case. Unfortunately, Poe's foster father, John Allen, will only pay for 1/3 of a year's tuition at UVA. And this really leads Poe to gamble quite a bit. So we know a little bit about Poe's time at UVA. We know he'll witness the death of its founder, Thomas Jefferson, on July 4th, as well as John Adams as well. We actually have records from UVA's library of books Poe is checking out at this time. So we know he's very interested in American history, modern and ancient languages at this time. But again, Poe is going to go deeper and deeper into debt at this time. And we know he'll return back to Richmond by the Christmastide season. Unfortunately, what should be a time of celebration is a time of heartbreak for Poe. When he returns back to Richmond, he finds his true love, Elmira, who he had been courting for the past year, already married to another man. Unfortunately, when Poe was at college, he would send love letters to Elmira, but her father intercepted all of those love letters, and she never received them. So she thought Poe forgot about her, and she went off and married another man. And this is one of the many tragedies that will face Poe during his early years. We also know at this time when Poe returns home around Christmastide, him and John Allen are going to get into another big fight. I actually have a letter from Poe over here where Poe says, quote, "My determination is to leave your house and endeavor to find some place in this wide world where I will be treated not as you have treated me. A collegiate education was what I most ardently desired. I've heard you say that you have no affection for me." So it definitely has a little bit of angst to it. Keep in mind, Poe is only around 18 years old at this point. But this is, one of the many quarrels that Allen and Poe will have in his youth. So we also know that Poe is going to, and we can actually see a picture of Elmira here. So again, this is who Poe was supposed to marry, but it did not work out the first time. So Poe is heartbroken. He is fighting with his foster dad, essentially saying, "I want nothing to do with you," right? He has lost the love of his life. So what do you do when you're an angsty 18-year-old? You're going to travel and you're going to write some sad poetry. And that's exactly what Poe does. Poe is going to head up to Boston in May of 1827. This is a view of Boston Harbor, a little bit past the time when Poe would be there. And here in Boston, he'll first actually publish his first collection of poems, but then he'll also register to serve in the Army. So these are actually Poe's enlistment papers that are part of the National Archives now. So at 22 years old, Poe will register to serve in the U.S. Army. Interestingly, he enlists under the alias of Edgar Perry. We're not exactly sure why. He lists his age as 22 years old, his birthplace as Boston, Massachusetts, his occupation as a clerk. And then this is where we get some personal description about Poe, as we do not have really any portraits of him in his youth. So he describes himself as having gray eyes, brown hair, fair complexion, and about 5'8". So you guys can take a look here, a little bit about Poe's enlistment papers. And like I mentioned, this is when Poe is going to also publish his first collection of poems. So this is the very first published work by Poe. It's called Tamerlane and Other Poems. He publishes it anonymously in June of 1827. And this is where poems such as Evening Star and The Lake were first printed. And actually only 50 copies were ever printed of this. It was not a success. And I believe only around 13 remain today. So again, Poe is still serving in the Army at this point. On October 31st, 1827, him and his regiment are going to head to Charleston, South Carolina, and stay at Sullivan's Island. He'll be there for about a year, and then he'll move to Fort Monroe, Virginia. At that time, it was called Fortress Monroe. And here in January, after serving for about a year and a half from this point, Poe will be promoted to Regiment Sergeant Major, which is actually very impressive to do in that little amount of time. Also, while he's here, his foster mother, Frances, will pass away, and he'll write the poem Alone based off of her passing. Poe is actually going to only stay at Fort Monroe for a few more months until he's discharged in April of 1829. He'll actually find a substitute to replace him at this time. Poe is kind of taking the next few steps in his military career. So again, he has a substitute serving for him in the U.S. Army, but his foster father, John Allen, is still recommending that he try to attend West Point Academy. John Allen, like I mentioned, is a very wealthy man, arguably one of the wealthiest men in Richmond again. And so because of John Allen's wealth and connections at this time, he has a lot of friends in high places that can offer Poe recommendations to West Point. Again, Poe is around 22, 23 at this point. And so this can kind of help Poe get to where John Allen thinks Poe needs to be. So Poe will receive a few different letters of recommendation from people at West Point, few different letters of recommendation to get Poe into West Point. One of the most famous people who will write Poe a letter of recommendation is actually General Winfield Scott. We know Scott today as, general during the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War. We have his portrait and his autograph in our collection today. So he was a close friend of Allen, and he'll write Poe a pretty nice letter of recommendation. And how does Poe repay him? Well, about 10 years later, Poe will actually write a story about General Winfield Scott criticizing him. That story is called The Man That Was Used Up. So very nice of Poe to repay that favor. We have a few other letters of recommendation that I've copied here. I'll read a few so we don't go too over with time. But these are all people Poe knew or John Allen knew. So some of these are from his officers while serving at Fort Monroe. Others are just close associates of John Allen. So one of Poe's officers said in 1829, Edgar Poe, the late sergeant major in the 1st Artillery, served under my command in company of the 1st Regiment Artillery from June 1827 to January of 1829, during which his conduct was unexceptionable. He at once performed the duties of company clerk and assistant in the subsistence department, both of which duties were promptly and faithfully done. His habits are good and entirely free from drinking. That's kind of an interesting quote, as we know Poe will actually very much struggle with substance abuse throughout his life. We also see another letter of recommendation from John Campbell, who pretty much says the same thing. And these letters of recommendation, as well as some of the letters from Poe's cadets at West Point, is really how we're getting to picture this, young poet, right? We have very few letters from Poe at this time, so these kind of descriptions of Poe are very helpful to us. And, John Campbell, who's a friend of Allen, describes him as, an orphan, a friendless youth, and he places every confidence of the character of Edgar Allan Poe. And we also have John Allen's letter of recommendation, which is very interesting. Again, him and Poe would quarrel quite often, but it really seems through John Allen's words that he really does want Poe to be in this, kind of nicer place, to be in the military, to be someone who can be respected. He kind of digs at Poe a little, saying, I have no relation to him whatsoever. But again, here in Allen's letter, he mentions that Poe is the grandson of the Quartermaster General Poe of Maryland. And again, his grandfather, David Poe, would know the Marquis de Lafayette quite well during the Revolutionary War. So this brings us to Poe at West Point. He will head to West Point in May of 1829 and end up arriving around June 20th that year. So again, we don't have too much from Poe at this time, but we do know a little bit about his time there. Just about 8 days once Poe lands at West Point, Poe will write to John Allen and he will say, quote, of the 130 cadets appointed every year, only 30 or 35 ever graduate, the rest being dismissed for bad conduct. The regulations are rigid in the extreme. I am at camp at present. My tent mates are Reed and John Ian Henderson, nephew of Major Easton, and William Telfair Stockton of Philadelphia. So again, Poe just got there about a week ago, and he's writing about his tent mates. We know from the summer of, July to August of 1829, Poe is going to be a part of the encampment at Camp Eaton in West Point. And then we know around August of the year is when the cadets are going to move into their barracks. We know Poe is going to room with a man by the name of Thomas Gibson, and he's in room 28 in the South Barracks. A little bit about Poe's time at West Point. We know some of the things that Poe is going to study. We know that he's going to study French and math, and Poe's actually excelling in these classes. We know that he is going to rank 17th out of 87 in math, and actually 3rd out of 87 in French, which is very impressive. We actually have a textbook that would have been at West Point during Poe's time. It's called the Theoretical Practical of Natural Philosophy, which sounds very interesting. So this is not Poe's textbook, but this is something he probably would have read at this time. And, you know, you can see it's very science and math heavy, which Poe was very interested in. And perhaps this textbook is what may have inspired him to write some of his science fiction stories much later in his life. A little bit later, Poe will write to Alan once again saying, quote, "I was in great hopes that you would come visit me in West Point while you were in New York. I was very much disappointed when I heard you had gone home without letting me hear from you." He also describes how he's an excellent standing of his class. The discipline is exceedingly rigid, and he has seen General Winfield Scott within West Point's grounds. So again, those are some of the letters we have from Poe, but what are his classmates saying about Poe? So one of his classmates, his name is Alan. He says, quote, "Poe was very shy and reserved in his intercourse. He mostly hung out with Virginians. He was an accomplished French scholar and really good at mathematics. He was very interested in books, which makes a lot of sense. But however, his great fault was his neglect and apparent contempt for military duties. His wayward and capricious temper made him at times utterly oblivious or indifferent to the ordinary routine of roll call, drills, and guard duties." So what we're kind of seeing at this point is that Poe is realizing that the military life is not for him. Although he's exceeding really well in his studies, the kind of rigid discipline is not really for Poe. And we know around halfway through, now around November of his time there, Poe is going to stop attending class. He's going to be missing roll calls. He is trying to purposely get himself kicked out. Another interesting thing about Poe's time at West Point is we know he was a little bit of a jokester. So looking at Timothy P. Jones' account of Poe, so he says he would often write some of the most forceful and vicious doggerel, have me copy it with my left hand in order so that it would be disguised and posted around the building. Locke, being one of Poe's professors, was one of the victims of Poe. He would often play the roughest jokes on those he disliked, and Jones says Locke he'd never seen a man despise someone as much as Locke did to Poe. And so a small fragment of a poem, or kind of a joking poem Poe would write about his professor Locke, still exists today, and it goes like this. "John Locke was a notable name. Joe Locke, the professor, was a greater in short, the former well known to fame, but the latter well known to report." Now, I personally don't think that's the funniest thing in the world, but a lot of Poe's cadets thought he was this really kind of funny he wrote these awful, like very targeted, mean poems, and they just loved him for that. However, unfortunately, at this time, Poe is again very much struggling. Again, he's also very low on money at this point. Alan is not sending him anything. And again, they get into another fight. In January 3rd of 1831, Poe will write to Alan once again. "I came home, you will remember, the night after the burial of Fanny, his foster mother. If she had not died while I was away, there would be nothing for me to regret. Your love I never valued, but she, I believe, loved me as her own child. You sent me to West Point like a beggar. The same difficulties are now threatening me before as in Charlottesville when he was at UVA and struggling. And I must resign. When I parted from you at the steamboat, I knew that I should never see you again. From the time of writing this, I shall neglect my studies and duties at this institution. If I do not receive your answer in 10 days, I will leave the point without, for otherwise I should subject myself to dismission." So Poe is low on money. He is struggling. He does not want to do his military career. And so he actually gets put on trial. And I believe he has around 44 different counts of extreme neglect of duty. And so he will go on trial, and eventually he is dismissed. A few of his classmates will actually kind of reflect many years later about Poe's dismissal. And again, this kind of gets us to know a little bit more about Poe than we would know in his letters. I know, I don't want to go over too much, but we can briefly read some of these. Timothy P. Jones writes again that Poe was one of the few true friends he ever knew. We also know that Poe, as Jones is describing, Poe would often lie quite often to his cadets. Poe describes serving in the Greek War of Independence in 1827, but he had never done that. Jones writes he had done no such thing. That about near as Europe as he ever got was for independence in Boston. We also know that one of his other classmates would write, Poe, was at West Point, very eccentric, and of course preferred making poetry verses and solving equations. Well, at the Academy, he had published a small volume of poems. These verses were a great source of merriment for us boys. And again, just kind of rude, crude writing about some of the professors. We actually know that some of the cadets who, again, really loved Poe's kind of nasty, more crude poems actually put together a bunch of money and actually helped publish one of his poetry collections. Unfortunately, the poems he published in this collection in April of 1831 were not the same crude poems Poe was passing around at West Point. These included love poems like The Sleeper, Lenore, and To Helen, very romantic poems. And so we actually have this very funny copy of this collection where one of Poe's classmates wrote in the margins, "This book is a damn cheat. All that fills the 124 pages could have been compiled in 35. So I think that's funny. So again, all these cadets put in a bunch of money. I think it cost around $1.25 per copy. And then they opened it up and it's just love poems. It wasn't the crude verses that they knew Edgar for. And this kind of brings us to the end of Poe's West Point career. We know by late February of 1831, Poe is gone at West Point, and he is heading back down to Baltimore, Maryland. Why Baltimore? Well, he has a few relatives living there on his father's side, and this is where actually he begins his literary career as a short story Gothic writer. So I know we don't want to go over too much, but what did the Pale Blue Eye get right and wrong about Edgar Allan Poe's time at West Point? Well, I would say a few different things. I think the thing that stood out to me the most was Harry Melling's accent. So before I say anything, I do want to give him credit. He is a British actor, and so I'm going to give him, a standing ovation. He did a great job. If I was to critique it, I thought it was more of a Southern Georgian accent, and Poe would have had a little bit more of a Tidewater Virginian accent. Is that a little nitpicky? Maybe so. I do work at the Poe Museum, so can't fault me too much. Even as we saw in the title slide, the two look very similar. So Poe would not have had a mustache at this time. These are the earliest portraits of Poe, and these are going to be when he's around 30, so about 8 years after he attended West Point. So again, he looks pretty similar. We know Harry Melling at the time of filming was around 30 when Poe would have been around 21, 22 at West Point. So, but he still looks pretty young. And we know when Poe was attending West Point, he would have been much older than some of his other cadets who would have been fresh out of, 18 years old at that time. In terms of clothing, from my understanding, this is fairly historically accurate. Again, I'm not a historical textiles person, but from my research at West Point, this is very similar to what Poe would have worn. Even kind of just the general look of clothing at this time with collars high up to the neck would have been the standard at this time. We actually know that Poe would have kept his West Point greatcoat. And this is actually a portrait of Poe wearing that very same West Point coat. So we know he kept it throughout his life. So looks pretty similar as well. Again, we do not have any photos or portraits of Poe when he's at West Point, but again, looks pretty similar. Again, don't quote me on that, I'm not a textiles person. And lastly, based off of the movie, besides the whole murder mystery, which did not actually happen, but in terms of what they got right about Poe's personality at this time, Poe was arguably a little bit of a divisive, arguably annoying person at this time. So they certainly got that kind of write about his personality. He was writing raunchy poems, which you see a little bit in the film as well, especially with the one of Joe Locke, his professor. And like I said, Poe did skip class. He was not that disciplined. So in terms of everything about Poe's personality, I think the movie got a lot of things right. Of course, I think the biggest thing that is not historically accurate is the plot. Even Augustus Landor is a reference to another Poe story, Landor's Cottage. As well as the Tale of the Ragged Mountains. So, there are a lot of Poe references in the films to stories he hadn't written yet. Of course, the whole plot of a murder mystery did not happen, but as a fun movie inspired by Poe, I think they do a lot right. And I think this focuses on a part of Poe's time that a lot of people don't know about. So I really applaud The Pale Blue Eye. I think they did a great job. And if you haven't watched it, it's a perfect spooky movie to watch this Halloween season. I know we're just about over 30 minutes, so I just want to plug a few things here at the Poe Museum. Again, if you want to learn more about Poe's time at West Point or Poe's literary career, definitely recommend checking out the Poe Museum. We're located in Richmond, Virginia, been there for over 100 years, and we have a few fun events coming up, including a free family day this Saturday, as well as our famous October Unhappy Hour on October 26th, which is a miserable time from 6 to 9. With that, I want to thank you guys so much for attending our Poe Pale Blue Eye West Point movie Mythbusting program. And thank you, Haley, as well. And I suppose we'll have about 30 minutes for questions.
Oh my gosh, Emma, thank you so much. Also, the casting directors in this film, they need a raise. Like, that's incredible.
Absolutely.
Wow. Very impressive. And for anybody who's curious about sort of the resources and events that Emma is sharing, I will follow up with information in an email to you tomorrow. So you don't necessarily have to frantically scramble it into your planner. You'll get another reminder from us. So if anybody has questions, we're kind of a small group. So if you would like, you can use your raise hand feature and unmute, or you're welcome to send anything in the chat. But while you guys do that, get your thoughts together, Emma, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So what would you say is, what are some of your top sort of Poe film adaptations? If this is a, made up plot that did have references to Poe's works, like what's a good version?
Okay, what's a good version? Well,
let's not say good. What's one of your favorites?
Okay, because there's some controversial takes in the Poe community. So I like
I'm a clerk.
So there are actually not too many like completely accurate adaptations of Poe's works. Consider a lot of his stories are only around 20 pages. So that's really hard to fill 2 hours. So I actually like some of the ones that are very fun and campy and just get you into the world of Poe that isn't necessarily historically accurate. So I know that's not good as a historian, but sometimes you just want a fun, campy movie. So some of the most famous movies relating to Poe are the Vincent Price, Roger Corman movies in the 1960s, specifically The Raven, which stars, I think it's Jack Nicholson's first film, Peter Lorre, Vincent Price. It has nothing to do with The Raven. They have like a wizard fight halfway through the movie. But does it get people interested in Poe? Absolutely. Now, if we want to talk about an actual accurate adaptation of a Poe work, it's not a movie. It's just a 4-minute episode of a TV show. The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode is the best adaptation of The Raven I have ever seen. James Earl Jones narrates The Raven. Come on.
Yes.
Come on. Yeah. And Bart plays the Raven. It's an abridged retelling, but it actually does a great job, and it's so good. We actually have a whole virtual program dedicated to that clip because it is just so good. So those are my answers: Vincent Price and The Simpsons.
I mean, 2 answers I did not expect to walk away with, if I'm going to be completely honest with you.
Right.
That's not what I expected, but amazing. Also, I've never seen that 1963 adaptation of The Raven, but I just looked up the movie poster. So I encourage all of you just to Google that. And it is very unexpected. The film poster is quite interesting. So I'm not gonna sort of crowd the stage with questions. Marilyn has a question. What were the circumstances of Poe's death?
Ooh, this is the number one question we get every single day. I'll go ahead and tell you guys the true cause of Poe's death. The true cause of Edgar Allan Poe's death is unknown. So I always lead you guys on. It is unknown, is a mystery. I do not know, but let's talk a little bit about what we do know. So we know Poe is actually, remember Elmira from the beginning of the program, they were set to marry, but then she married another man. Well, 20 years go by, they're both widows, and they're set to marry again in 1849. So total notebook situation, lost lovers reunited. But before they marry in October 49, Poe decides he needs to take a big trip up north. So we know Poe departs Richmond September 26, 1849. And then once he boards a steamboat, he's not heard from again in 8 days. When he's next found, he's found in Baltimore, Maryland. He's wearing someone else's clothes. He's delirious. He's found by a tavern near a polling place on election day. So we know after a few hours after he's found, he's taken to the hospital. And for the next 4 days, he goes in and out of consciousness. At one point, Poe screams the name Reynolds. And then we know on October 7th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe will pass away at the age of 40. So that's what we know. So again, we still do not know exactly how Poe died. Research is still being done to this day. But one of the most prevalent theories is a theory called cooping, also known as voting fraud. So we do know that this was a real practice that happened in Baltimore during the election when Poe was there, where people would try to gather gullible people, force them to drink, and then send them into the polling booth. And when they came out, dress them in someone else's clothes so they could go in and out all throughout the city. So did Poe fall victim to cooping? It's a possibility. Could have been other factors like alcohol poisoning, a brain hemorrhage, absolutely as well. So some of the most prevalent theories are, there's rabies as a theory, diabetes, brain hemorrhage, even childhood trauma, syphilis. These are all theories that have been published. But I think, in my honest opinion, it is so Poe to not know, right? It is so Poe because Poe is actually the creator of the very first detective story ever written. So this just plays into this mystique of Poe. And I think it's one of the reasons he's actually still remembered today, not only because of his literary legacy, but this kind of cult-like mystique that follows him. So sorry I couldn't give you an exact answer, but it's just something so Poe about him. All right. So I see another question. Did Poe ever have more interaction with John Allan? So actually, no. Poe will storm out of the Allan home a little bit later. He'll return back to Richmond in around 1832. And Poe and John Allan have a huge falling out. I mean, they had several at this point, but this one was bad, where he came home and he ran through the door and he met this woman and he said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm John Allan's wife." And this is already after Poe's foster mother has passed away. So John Allan had got remarried to Louisa G. Allan. And by the time Poe returned, John Allan had 2 legitimate sons with Louisa G. Allan. This means in John Allan's will, Poe would never be considered. Again, Poe was just a foster child. John Allan and Frances never had any legitimate children. So now John Allan has 2 legitimate children, which will be in his will. And this is what did it for Poe. So they will never have an interaction again. John Allan will pass away when Poe is around 30-ish years old. And we know John Allan is buried next to his 2 wives at Shockoe Hill Cemetery, which is about 1.5 miles away from the Poe Museum. All right. So I see another question. Was the depiction of West Point in the movie fairly accurate for the time? So I do want to say that they did film at West Point a little bit. I don't know how much was soundstage versus on-site location. From my understanding of West Point, yes. So let's go back to a little bit looking at some of the depictions of West Point at this time. So this is a depiction of West Point. So from my understanding, I've never been to West Point, but looking at some of the primary sources that I was seeing at this time, I would say, yes, it looked fairly accurate. Again, West Point hasn't also changed. I don't believe the exterior is too much since the 1830s when Poe was there. Of course, you know, there were a lot of interior shots as well. But from my understanding, yes, it also looked fairly accurate. We can also see another picture of Poe at West Point here. It's a little blurry, but this gives us a good landscape. So I think they also did a pretty good job with the setting as well. Okay, another good question. Other than liquor, what other substance does Poe abuse or partake in? So, you know, this is certainly a difficult subject, so we always just like to give a content warning when we talk about this. But Poe certainly struggled with substance abuse throughout his life. We know his father did as well, so there might have been some genetic relation there. And of course, Poe faced a lot of loss from his mother, his best friend's mother, his foster mother, his wife Virginia, several people, his brother. So we know Poe did partake in alcohol, but he was not actually a heavy drinker. Poe, we do know from accounts of friends, just could not handle his liquor. We do know at one point, and again, I just want to say content warning one more time, Poe will purposely try to take large amounts of laudanum, which I believe is an opioid. And after a failed proposal to Sarah Helen Whitman, a spiritualist and poet in New York who he was very enamored with. Thankfully, Poe survived and was all right. But actually, one of the most famous portraits of Poe, which I'm not sure if it's here, it's not this one, but kind of the iconic image of Poe that I'm sure you've seen on t-shirts everywhere, that is the portrait that was taken 4 days after his attempt with laudanum. All right. Okay, ooh, some more good questions. Yeah. In the film, Poe claims to Christian Bale's detective that he felt burdened and been ridiculed all his life about his physical stature, such looks. As far as historians know, what was this Poe's actual perception of himself? Now, that's actually a fantastic question. So yes and no, it kind of depends on the point in Poe's life in his childhood. So again, Poe was well known for being very athletic as a kid. So again, he holds the world record for the longest mile swam upstream. He was also a boxer as a kid, and he was 5'8", which you know, was pretty average, you know, which is fine. We do know that in regards to how other people who knew Poe felt, they described him as very difficult, very abrasive sometimes, kind of a tell it like it is. In terms of how Poe actually viewed himself, he did often claim, you know, that he was often ridiculed and was very much an other. However, the reason I'm hesitating with answering this question is Poe did write an autobiography, but much of that autobiography is made up. Again, in that autobiography, he claimed to fight in the War of Greek Independence, which he did not. So it's always a little hard to say, is this Poe telling the truth? Is this how he really felt? Or, you know, was he maybe telling a little bit of a fib? I'm not exactly sure. But a lot of people who even describe Poe as very kind of, you know, brash, you know, very much enjoyed his presence, especially as he got a little bit older as well, and immersed himself in the literary circles. He also did make quite a few enemies throughout his life, several enemies, including Rufus Griswold and Ralph Waldo Emerson as well. So I can't exactly answer that question, but I hope that helps just a little bit. It is said that Poe had mental health issues and that his stories were a way of healing. How accurate is this? So this is another one of kind of myths that we hear a lot at the museum. So I always like to clarify when I answer this question that at first, you know, I'm a historian at heart. So that is what I am. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't retroactively diagnose someone. So again, I also want to preface by saying science and medical understanding is more of an art than a science than it is back then than it is today. So we're using what people described mental illness back then and trying to view it through a modern lens, right? So that's just some preface I want to say. So we do not know if Poe had any mental illness. A lot of people after Poe's death would claim that he did. One of the reasons for this is actually because of his parents' profession. I mentioned that Poe's parents were actors. I'm sure some of you all may know that acting was considered a very low-level profession in the early 19th century. And so a lot of people prescribed that since his mother, Eliza Poe, was a renowned actress, that this influenced Poe and caused him mental health problems. Now, is that necessarily true, or would that be the root cause? No. May have had Poe had mental health issues? Yes. Again, we can't really retroactively diagnose him. But a lot of people tend to view Poe as this dark and tortured artist who, again, very much similar in the light of Van Gogh, who was suffering and so used his poems and his stories as an outlet. That is not the full truth. That, two parts to that. One, Poe's main goal as a writer was to make money. That is very clear through his writings. And so the reason Poe was writing Gothic stories at this time was that's what sold, right? It's just like horror movies when they come out in the theaters today. It's going to be packed opening night. The Gothic was a genre that was booming at this time. Frankenstein had already been published, right? So Poe was writing these stories because he was trying to make a buck, right? But the reason why we often view Poe as this dark and tortured artist really has to do with his rival, Rufus Griswold. Rufus Griswold and Poe were once very close associates turned enemies due to an unfavorable review Poe wrote about Griswold. And after Poe's death, Griswold will publish Poe's obituary and later biography, and he really does this with the intention of bad-mouthing and discrediting Poe. He calls Poe a drunk madman who is obsessed with death. And again, once Griswold published this biography, it raises Poe's image, and people become obsessed with Poe as this, again, dark and tortured artist. And it's not entirely true. It's a mischaracterization of Poe, but that image of Poe, that mischaracterization, has very much persisted in the past 150 years. And so again, while Poe certainly struggled, again, he faced a lot of loss, right? And he may have struggled with, mental illness, and that's certainly theorized. I always just like to provide a little bit of historical context on why we think that way before we diagnose Poe. All right. Okay, last question I see. Why was he so harshly criticized and demeaned by the literary critics at that time? So Poe is going to be one of the first American literary critics at this time. And literary criticism was, already flourished in the UK at this time. Although criticism over there was a little bit more of a tit for tat, and that's how it kind of moved over to the US in the early Republic. So, I'll write a favorable review for you, you write a favorable review for me, you know how it goes. But Poe did not do that. That is why he made a lot of enemies, including why he became enemies with Griswold. Griswold wrote a very favorable review on one of Poe's stories, expecting the same in return, and Poe was very harsh. And so a lot of people liked this about Poe, and it really changed literary criticism in the early to mid 19th century. And so again, that's why Poe made several enemies, including Emerson, Griswold, several others. But a lot of people also very much supported Poe, including Dickens, Charles Dickens, and several other, Nathaniel Hawthorne as well. And so again, it's kind of going back to Poe's personality from a young age. We can see he is a very difficult figure to get along with, which, can be good, can be bad, but that's one of the reasons he would be harshly criticized. Any other questions?
I think we might have gotten everybody. Emma, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise and going through Poe's life and the film with us.
Of course, yeah, it's great to go from intern to presenter at the VMHC.
Yes, Emma was once an education intern at the VMHC, so we are so proud to see Emma in flourishing in this new role. So we're super proud and excited to have the partnership. So I think that brings us to an end, guys. Again, thank you so much for joining us for Movie Mythbusting. As always, we love bringing you guys these programs. So if anybody has any suggestions for films you'd like to see busted, or any recommendations, please, you've got my email address. I would love to hear from you. If you hear my daughter screaming, I apologize. I just want to let you guys know our next movie myth bust will be on December 12th. We're going to be myth busting October Sky in connection with our Apollo exhibition as it comes to a close at the end of December. And then looking forward, we will be myth busting the film Marshall with the John Marshall Center. And we've got a few more films sort of up our sleeves for the rest and going into the spring. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Hi, guys.